Our friend Washington D.C. Every minute, like she's a seminary graduate for working on.
Hello, friends. Welcome to our international seminar, elaborating the theology of grief, ecumenical commitment. I hope you can hear me well. Yes? Okay, nice. I asked Irina to record our meeting as well. Thank you. So, hello from Lviv, from Ukraine, and it's our big pleasure to greet you all at the online and a live seminar which will raise an important and hard questions and issues of Christian faith and human sufferings. We titled this seminar Elaborating a Theology of Grief, Ecumenical Commitment. This seminar is organized by the Institute of Ecumenical Studies by the support of our Dutch friends from Kerk in Actie. The format of our seminar is alive, and as I told you, we are sitting at the conference hall of the Theological Department of the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, but also our event is broadcasting through Zoom. The working language of our seminar will be English. The duration of our event will be around 1 hour and a half. This time we will have 5 esteemed speakers, which will present their topics within 15 or 20 minutes. After each speaker, there will be a short question and 1-2 minutes for an answer. And in the end of the presentation, we'll have around 20 minutes or more for bigger Q&A session. During the seminar, we will seek to provide answers or rather outline certain insights and proposals on profound theological and pastoral questions related to suffering, grief, and Christian faith. The overreaching question we will explore is, where is loving and almighty God when people suffer? More specifically, we will reflect on such a question: why does God allow human suffering? How can we bear witness to God in the aftermath of horrific massacres in Bucha, Hostomel, or other Ukrainian cities and villages? How can we recognize God's presence amid sufferings and grief? Where is justice when the strong needs the weaker? How can church communities accompany people throughout grief and pain while offering hope in the light of the gospel? How should churches develop an inclusive pastoral approach that addresses deep trauma and loss? In what ways can ecumenical commitment strengthen the church's response to suffering and injustice? The context. In the context of the ongoing Russian military aggression against Ukraine, these questions take an even greater urgency. The reality of suffering and loss requires a throughout full, compassionate, and faith-rooted response from churches and faith community. Our discussions will focus on theological reflection, pastoral engagement, and ecumenical solidarity as ways to navigate the ongoing tragedy while upholding faith, hope, and injustice. To take on this challenging task of addressing such profound questions, we invited esteemed speakers from Ukraine and abroad, representing various Christian traditions. To introduce the theme of the theology of grief and its pastoral dimension, we are honored to welcome a distinguished guest from the United States. He's no stranger to Ukraine, He visited Ukraine for several times, and even before our seminar, he already visited several Ukrainian cities like Kuz and Vinnytsia, where he served to Ukrainian communities with pastoral and missionary service. I asked Reverend Rodger Murchison, Doctor of Ministry, which made his PhD in Princeton Theological Seminary. He's a Baptist minister and also several books and especially most famous one is a guide for grief, help in surviving the stages of grief and bereavement after a loss. We look forward to your insights as you share your deep experience and pastoral wisdom in navigating grief and loss.
Thank you, Roman. And I want to express our gratitude for putting this seminar together and inviting us to be participants. I'm glad to be with this team. Thank you, Roman. Looking at the theme of elaborating a theology of grief, ecumenical commitment, I think our first question is, what is a theology of grief? What does that word or phrase even mean? The Bible gives us some suggestions about the theology of grief, and we first see it
Yes. Hey. Yeah.
Okay. We first see the theology of grief in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. It reads like this: I would not have you uninformed, my friends, concerning those who are already dead. You should not be weighed down in grief like those who have no hope or faith. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, God will bring back to life those who believe in Jesus. As you hear 1 Thessalonians, you can wonder, is Paul suggesting that Christians should grieve differently than non-Christians? Yes, I believe he is. I believe he's suggesting that our theology of grief is somehow based on our faith or lack thereof faith. Paul is establishing a grief-faith relationship. In a recent article that I wrote for Theological Reflections, Eastern European Journal of Theology, I talked about the effects that grief and faith, this relationship, what it has on a person's individual life and their faith. The underlying hypothesis was that persons involved in an active Christian lifestyle, they should be strengthening their faith because the grief-faith relationship should support them and help them in their life. I'm defining an active Christian lifestyle as a person who attends church regularly and also allows their faith to influence their daily life. A definition of the grief-faith relationship may be found in the book Guide for Grief. This definition is expressed in a literary couplet that says, allow your faith to inform your grief and allow your grief to inform your faith. Let me explain this literary couplet. Faith can and should inform our grief. Some people assume that if you're a Christian, your faith will inevitably provide an advantage during the grief process. As mentioned earlier, you might even quote 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Our faith in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior can tell our grief there is hope, there is a future. Our faith should inform our grief. One interpretation of 1 Thessalonians would be to affirm that Christians will find a theology of grief is to be found in the hope and faith that they have in Jesus Christ, but also, even going through sorrow and loss and grief, can theology be found in their suffering? And yet, the assumption, I think, has an obvious flaw when you think about it. The flaw would be this: the Apostle Paul affirms that Christians should not grieve like others who are not Christians, because Christians do have this hope and faith in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. But the issue is, will Christians recognize the hope that's available? Will Christians even utilize the hope that they see in the face of grief? Some Christians may not even relate their faith to their grief. I found this true in many of the grief workshops and seminars that I led in my church. Another powerful text that can give insight into the theology of grief is the story of the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even if he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die." Jesus is giving counsel and hope to the living and the dead. To those who are dead, Jesus is resurrection hope. To those who are living in grief, Jesus is abundant life. Jesus is both resurrection and life. So, as faith can inform our grief, also grief can inform our faith. Faith is not a static or unchanging feeling that once appropriated, it is never altered. Faith should be active, living, changing, always seeking God in new places and in new ways. Can grief be an opportunity for maturing our faith? I think yes. As we see in the story of the resurrection of Lazarus, the obvious miracle was when the dead man was brought back to life. But if you notice carefully, the greater miracle was when Lazarus' sister, Martha, realized that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. That miracle was a demonstration of the theology of grief. Martha allowed her grieving.
Sorry, because the presentation didn't switch on the. Because the presentation was switched on the computer, but not for the audience.
Okay. We read that you didn't see all those slides. We'll catch you up. We're looking at John chapter 11. This is the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. And I was talking about that Jesus is resurrection hope. And the resurrection hope, resurrection for the dead, but hope for the living. And I mentioned that the miracle is often raising a dead man back to life. But I said the greater miracle is when Martha, the sister of Lazarus, realized that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. And then Martha declared to everyone there that Jesus was the Christ, the Son of the living God. And when she made that declaration, that changed everything for Martha. So indeed, faith and grief were speaking to each other. She, in many ways, was allowing her faith to inform her grief. John chapter 11 is a wonderful chapter of looking at the issue of grief, faith, and hope. Martha was living out her faith. In many ways, grief was informing faith, and she was a demonstration of the theology of grief. Grief is one of those occasions in life when we begin to assess who we are and what we believe in. It is very appropriate for those who grieve to ask many deep questions about their faith, questions about God, to stretch their faith, and even to search for new horizons of truth. Grief can indeed inform our faith, and possibly through grief, we can begin to discover a theology of grief. A basic understanding of the theology of grief may be found when we look at the concept of God. Who is God? When we think about this whole idea, God through the lens of grief, I think it's how we should look at the country of Ukraine when we think about God. Let's look at how we perceive God in the face of unprovoked injustice, atrocities, immense suffering caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I especially point to the trauma and intense violence in Bucha that you mentioned earlier, Roman. How does the theology of grief appropriately view God in the face of pain and misery and death? In the book of Ruth, we begin to see some examples. The book of Ruth gives us some answers. The book of Ruth tells us about Naomi and her family. It reminds us that many people grieve. They often blame God in the middle of their grief for all of their misfortune. Listen to Naomi and her painful lament as she experienced the death of her husband and her two sons. In her grief, Naomi accuses God. And she laments by saying, "The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Blaming God for human death is common. It is a natural question to ask about God's goodness and God's power in the face of grief and sorrow. The idea is so prevalent that an entire branch of theology called theodicy has come up and tried to defend God's goodness and power in the face of suffering and death. Here is the theological dilemma for those of faith who are grieving. If God is all good, why does he allow evil, pain, grief, and death? If God is all powerful, why does he not stop evil, pain, grief, and death? Either God is not all good and does not care about the suffering of humanity, or God is not all powerful and cannot stop the suffering of humanity. This theological dilemma can be very problematic for those of faith who are grieving. This is an ancient quandary dating back as far as Epicurus in the 4th century BC. The question of God's goodness and power can be directly related to one's understanding of grief itself. If a person of faith begins to question God's ultimate ability and willingness to help them in times of loss, it can intensify and increase their feeling of grief and make the pain more sorrowful. As mentioned earlier, this was exactly what happened to Naomi. She said in Ruth chapter 1, "I went away full, and the Lord has brought me home empty. Do not call me Naomi. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." Naomi's lamentation, do you hear it? Her lamentation is the idea that she went away from Bethlehem full with a husband and two sons, and now she's returning to Bethlehem empty as a widow and motherless. Her grief has crippled, and it has brought disability to her faith. And she has changed her name to Mara, meaning bitter. Naomi in Hebrew meant pleasant and sweet. I'm suggesting that Naomi's theology of grief and her understanding of God was influenced by the way she dealt with pain and loss and death. Naomi blamed God for her grief and her problems in her life. One theologian suggests an alternative theology of grief. The suggestion is the God I believe in does not send us the problem. He gives us the strength to cope with the problem. Another way to understand and interpret God's goodness and power in the face of evil and suffering and death and pain is the concept of free will. Free will is the idea that humans have the ability to make their own choices
Recording in progress.
and determine their own fate in life without interference from outside forces, even God. If humans are totally free to make their own choices, then humanity will live in a world that is both good and evil. A pastor who understood the theology of grief in a war zone was Reverend Dr. Leslie Weatherhead from the church, the City Temple Church in London, England. He was pastor of this church from 1936 to 1960. He was ministering to a congregation during the trauma of World War II. In 1941, the church building was destroyed by an incendiary bomb that was dropped during the Blitz of London. Weatherhead continued to minister to his congregation all throughout the war. His congregation asked their pastor this question over and over. Where is this evil coming from? Where is this suffering? Where is this pain? Weatherhead published his book, The Will of God, in 1944. The war was raging on and would not end until 1945. He wrote the book in 44. In 45, the war was over, so he wrote all during the time of the war. What would a pastor say to his people who were grieving not only the death of their loved ones, but also grieving the destruction of their church and grieving the challenging they were facing in a faltering faith that was questioning their good God? Where is this good God in the midst of all this evil when London is falling all around us? Sound familiar to Ukraine? Those who mourn might ask Weatherhead, in the harsh reality of war, how would you interpret for us Romans 8:28? We know that in all things, God works together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose. All things work for good? Are you telling me all things? Where is God in the middle of this war? Can that be good? What is his will for innocent people to be dying and suffering? Weatherhead penned his words about the will of God exactly during this time. And during this time, Weatherhead began to put forth a threefold understanding of the will of God. In his book, he mentions these three ideas. First is the intentional will of God. It's God's ideal plan for humanity, his intentional will. Second is God's circumstantial will. God's plan within certain circumstances, the circumstantial will of God. And third, the ultimate will of God. God's final realization of his purpose, his ultimate will. Would the war in Ukraine be God's intentional will? No. God does not intend for his creation to be at war. As Weatherhead explained it, God is creator and sustainer of our world. Yes, death is a part of life for every one of us, but God is not a murderer. Weatherhead argues passionately. All of his readers, Weatherhead's readers, understood that war can kill millions of people. But Weatherhead argued that it's not God's will for people to die this way. It's not what God would want. Yet God can work his good even in evil circumstances. That's his circumstantial will. There's a possibility within every tragedy that God can forge a future of renewed hope. The people of Ukraine do not have to be defined by this war. We cannot deny that suffering, pain, and grief and loss are there in this war. Grief and sorrow are a natural emotion felt by those who are living in this kind of catastrophe. Can we say there's any ultimate good even in war? This would be God's ultimate will? Is there any hope for those who are dealing with catastrophic grief and searching for a theology of hope during wartime? Here's where Weatherhead leads us in his analysis. Weatherhead does not believe that God causes tragedy like this war, so some ultimate good can be realized. I mean, what kind of God would do that? To realize his ultimate good in the middle of a war? God did not send this war or want this war. God would want us to realize that what kind of good God is he? Weatherhead believed that God's intentional will is sometimes altered by factors in this world like war. God actively works in spite of these circumstances. God can take the bereavement we are now experiencing and allow the grief and pain we carry to bring us to renewed faith and renewed hope. I've had many hours of conversation and shared ministry with a Ukrainian pastor who exemplifies what I think is, in the middle of tragic circumstances of this war, he sees a way to not let God's ultimate will be thwarted and put down. This pastor here in Ukraine is forging a theology of grief on the anvil of hope for those who are hopeless, for faith for those who are faithless, and for those who only see hate in this world, he's trying to give them hope. This pastor is not giving up. This pastor ministered in the town of Bereavement in eastern Ukraine. After the Russians invaded in 2022, the occupation of his city, this pastor and many other Christians felt threatened in many ways. They made the decision to relocate as refugees in the city of Venetia. They left behind in Bereavement their family, their home, their jobs, their church, their memories of what was and now is no more. They were experiencing devastating grief, but they were determined that grief would not destroy them or destroy their faith. In their newly adopted home in Venetia, they established a new church. It began with 6 members in April of 2022. Today, the worship attendance is 75 and growing. I preached in that church last Sunday. The church has multiple ministries in Venetia and throughout Ukraine, and even the church goes weekly to soldiers on the front lines and civilians who can't escape the front lines of war. This faithful pastor and his courageous congregation are demonstrating how even in the face of grief and loss, renewed faith is a possibility. This church is living proof that a theology of grief can be birthed in a diverse ecclesiastical community. This is a religious community that is pushing through their grief and discovering the transformative power of hope and faith, even in a war zone. Last Sunday, there were 80 people in the room, and I asked a show of hands of how many were refugees. 70 of the 80 were refugees. Elaborating a theology of grief is not about being Catholic, Orthodox, Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, Mennonite. A theology of grief requires an ecumenical commitment from all Christian faith fellowships. This seminar, Roman, I think, is a perfect example of how all Christian traditions can learn from each other. And as we listen and dialogue together, that's how we begin elaborating a theology of grief.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Looking for doing the job really excellent, because this is very important to have introduction with the team, and I like also your word that first of all the theology of grief we have to listen, yes, because sometimes we know that theologists or priests or pastors should speak and more. Here we have to listen first, and afterwards just to give examples. And also this is an ecumenical issue for us, how to develop the theology of grief, how to stay close to those who suffer, and how to help them to understand the situation of need and pain. We have still one short question for Rodger, so I ask those who presented here in the seminar and also online participants online. We have even a greater community online participating, so just raise your questions and to Rodger. If not, maybe I also have another question. So you speak that sometimes when we speak about massacres, that people are doing some bad things to another, but when we speak about natural disasters. So I had one explanation that God creating the world gives the free will not only to human being, but also to nature. Because some could we speak about the free will of nature when this natural disaster happens and causes different destructions and human death?
Yeah. We felt that very personally in my home, Roman, in Augusta, Georgia. A hurricane, Helene, came through Augusta in September. Remember, when I was here with you in September, that hurricane came through September 27th and destroyed many homes, killed people in my own city. My neighbors' homes were destroyed and couldn't live in their home. So many were asking the question, where is God in the middle of this hurricane, this storm? And I think the answer, Weatherhead gives us that same example, that God is with us even during the tragedy of natural disaster, as well as the war-torn disaster that can be a man-made disaster. And I think we of faith need to listen to our congregation. After that hurricane came through, we at the church said people can come to our church and share their pain and sorrow. We gave away water, food, clothing, but we also gave away the gospel. We listened and said, God is with us even in this tragedy. We did not say that God sent the storm. We said God was with us in the storm. And I think that's biblical. If you remember Jesus in the storm, on the lake, the Sea of Galilee, he was in the storm. He could calm and make peace the storm, but he told the disciples, oh, ye of little faith. So part of the conversation is the storm that surges inside us. So I try to remind our congregation in Augusta, this storm is not what God wanted, but even in the storm, we have faith and stand together.
Okay. Thank you, Rodger, for your excellent explanation and for your insights.
You're welcome.
So right now we are moving to Dr. Yulia Vintoniv. She is lecturer at the Ukrainian Catholic University. She made her PhD in a special theme of Godforsakenness, and right now she will have her contribution entitled "A Mourning of God Himself: The Silent Godforsaken Prayer." So she will speak about initial insights from Hans Urs von Balthasar and Jürgen Moltmann, and especially about this special moment of lowliness of Christ on the cross. Julia?
One second. We have technical problem again. Talk about honor to look into profound and often unsettling aspect of theology, the concept of God's own mourning, His co-suffering with humanity or compassion, as expressed in the silent God-forsaken prayer of the Father. This is not a comfortable topic. It confronts us with the raw, unfiltered reality of suffering and challenge our understanding of divine being. From the ancient text of the Old Testament, we see signal of God who is not detached, but deeply affected by the trouble of His people. Passages speak of God's sorrow, jealousy, anger, emotions that resonate with human experience. The prophets, those chosen to speak God's voice, embodied this solidarity, becoming a living testament to divine empathy. Even the line that I put in the title, "A Mourning of God Himself," it is the concept that we see in book of Amos, chapter 8. I will make the sun go down at noon, the darker the easter of broad daylight. I will make the time like morning for an only son, and the end of the like a bitter day. And we all recognize this description in the New Testament as cosmological science when Christ was crucified. However, in 20th century, scared by the horrors of Auschwitz, destroyed many traditional theological frameworks. Now, how could a just and merciful God remain silent in the face of the suffering? Elie Wiesel wrote memorable words. Never shall I forget that smoke, those flames that consumed my fate forever, those moments that murdered my God and my soul. Never shall I forget those things that even were I condemned to life as long as God himself. Never. Echo of the profound crisis of faith experienced by so many Ukrainians right now. This era demanded a rethinking of traditional theological concept. Jewish theological shifted from the viewing suffering as punishment to understanding it as a trial of faith. Similarly, in Christianity, Maximus the Confessor once defined one form of the experience of Godforsakenness as a trial of faith. Historically, Christian theology grappled with the concept of patripassianism, the heresy that the Father himself, using body of Christ, suffered on the cross. The early church rejected this, seeking to uphold the distinct hypostasis of the Trinity. Yet to discount the Father's co-suffering leaves us with the cold, distant God, a silent heaven, undefined by our price. The 20th century saw theologians daring to explore the idea of the Father's co-suffering. Simone Weil spoke of the difficulty of loving God, a struggle that arises from the God's perceived silence, his hiddenness, which paradoxically becomes an opportunity to love him, as the Father willed to remain hidden. On the one hand, silence is often interpreted as inaction, even indifference, provoking resentment, rebellion, and protest. On the other hand, it reflects a deep longing of God's participation in human suffering, sometimes traditionally thought impossible. Such demands reshape of the image of God, yet they also introduce complex theological dilemmas, including the risk of anthropomorphism, reducing the divine to human concept of love, co-suffering, and empathy. And how about the impossibility of God? The question that may arise right now, can God still be a God if he co-suffer? Balthasar also addressed the question, where is the merciful God in the face of suffering? He argues that this question stems from an anthropocentric view, yet it is a valid question born from the very heart of human pain. He pointed to Christ's descent into the hell as the ultimate act of God's solidarity, a journey into the realm of the powerless, where Christ strength in rebellion of his weakness. Christ's cry on the cross, a shift from the Father to God, signed a profound moment of human solidarity. He takes one burden of every human cry, every moment of the despair. Balthasar explored the concept of Godforsakenness as an event between the Father and each individual. Christ's cry, my God, why you have forsaken me, is not a sign of abandonment, but a breach, a way for God to enter into the very depth of human suffering. Balthasar spoke of cosmic value of the inner hour of the darkness, symbolized by the darkness of the crucifixion, the tearing of the temple veil and the earth shook, Matthew and Mark. These are not mere natural phenomena, they are signs of the mourning of God himself, as Balthasar wrote. The darkness, similar of the darkness of creation, suggested a return to the very foundation of existence, To approach the Father co-suffering and save the impossibility without simply projecting human emotion into him, we must not only speak of the Son's kenosis, but also of the kenosis of the Father. This is kenosis of love, one that does not erase suffering, but instead participate in it, as if experiencing it firsthand, which is its deepest sense is the definition of love. Additionally, we can look at the concept of kenosis, the self-emptying of God, as the key of understanding this co-suffering. Both the Son and the Father experience kenosis. The Son is in his incarnation and crucifixion, and the Father in his willingness to allow his Son to suffer. This mutual kenosis reveals a God who is not distant and powerful, but deeply involved in the human condition. Jürgen Moltmann emphasized that it was not the Father who imposed the crucifixion, but the Son who freely embraced it. The Father's consent to this sacrifice is an act of love, a love that shares in the Son's suffering. Moltmann argued that the Father's grief is as essential to understanding of Son's crucifixion. Moltmann, in the attempt of comprehend the Father's participation in suffering, coined the new term patri compassione to emphasize of Trinity suffering, which means the Father has compassion. Moltmann wrote, the abandonment on the cross which separates the Son from the Father is something that takes place within God himself. God against God, separation that leads a reunion for all humanity. Moltmann stressed that Christ drowned into the Father's embrace with the cry, my God, but for the deeper understanding of this word, it is first necessary to recognize that this act of Christ's fate has preceded by trial. The parable of the prodigal son with its image of loving father waiting in agony provides a powerful metaphor for God's love and his compassion. And conclusions. As Emmanuel Levinas observed, there is no escape from suffering. The answer is not in intellectual justification, but it is very act of being present in suffering. The cry of Godforsakenness is not a sign of God's absence, but depressed searching for his presence. It is an act of faith and testament to the enduring power of love. The exploration of God's compassion is not mere speculation. It is necessary confrontation with the problem of evil and suffering. It is God's silence powerless. Is God's silence powerless, or it is an act of profound trust, allowing humanity to experience the full weight of its choices. The mourning of God himself challenges us to reimagine our understanding of the divine. It invites us to see God not as a distant observer, but as one who is compassionate in our pain. In this context, the silence of God takes a new meaning. It is not a silence of absence, but a silence of presence, a silence that invites us to enter into the depth of divine love. It is the silence that speaks louder than any words, assuring us that even in the darkest moment, we are not forsaken. And the last, this understanding of God, compassion, also challenge us to reconsider our own responses to suffering. Are we willing to enter into the pain others or bear their burdens to offer our presence as a sign of hope? Or do we turn away seeking to avoid the discomfort of compassion? I will finish with a piece of one of the soldiers and poets, Artur Dron, with the title, The First Letter to the Corinthians. Love is patient, love is kind. It is not jealous, it is not proud. Love is terrified like a beast, but it is preserved. Love could give up and abandon it all, but it persists. Sometimes love has gunshot wounds to its legs, or bullet fragment lodged in them. For some time, the shelling is over the friends, but for some time the shelling is over. The friends close love's eyes, wrap it up in the sleeping bag, and carry it away, and then it passes to the leaf. Thank you.
Thank you. Presentation, and that it's not only about theoretical thinking regarding the means of suffering, but really when you cited this passage from the soldier that's and about these wounds and that eyes, this is very close to us, and that's why Ukrainian, in the midst of this war, is trying to really to see God in these hard circumstances, and we desperate search for His presence among us. So, with one short question to Yulia, and before I ask Father Oleg to continue our discourse.
And
I have a question for Yulia, but maybe later after my
I
presentation.
don't hear you. We don't hear you. Okay, we hear you.
Father Oleg, can we ask you?
Yes, I will integrate my question into my presentation because thank you, Yulia, and thank you, Rodger, as well. These were wonderful talks before me. Are you able to hear me quite well? I'm in certain circumstances where yeah, I'm not in a regular setting, but I'll do my best to share with you some of my intuition and some of my thinking. Recently, well, I must confess, for the last several years, actually, I've come to understanding that, of course, our theological understanding is always enriched by scientific research from other domains, from other veins of life, and one of them, which is in particularly today is flourishing, is psychology. And so my first thesis, or my first thought, is that grief is in contemporary popular perception is usually understood as a certain psychological state of mind. We always think that, you know, if somebody is grieving, that means that there is this psychological perception that we have. This is an emotion that a person enters into and sometimes can be there for quite a long time. Just like fear, just like other emotions that surround us. And emotions are extremely important for us. So psychologists are actually explaining, they explain that just as fear, anger, embarrassment, and pain, grief belongs to a group of the so-called cold emotions, which are necessary on one hand, since they are a natural reaction to the circumstances that are around us. For instance, if there's somebody who dies and we love that person, then we are grieving, we are mourning that person. Sometimes we feel that we don't want to live, we want to follow as if into even deeper state of this empathy. Sometimes we feel anger and fear that this is something that may happen to us. These cold emotions are actually intertwined, and these psychologists are actually, I don't want to go into details, but they explain that there is a certain gradation. The coldest emotion, they say, it's death, because it's an when a person is dead, that's when a person is coldest, so to say. But then above death is a feeling of abandonment and depression. A person in the state of depression constantly is thinking about dying, and step up from depression is grief, and then anger and fear. All these emotions are important to us, and we're living through them. But what is sometimes dangerous is when we get stuck in those emotions, and that's when they may develop into certain obsessions, and even may have result on our physical health as well. So emotions are important, but it is important not to get stuck in them. On the other hand, of that scale of emotions, where grief is one of the coldest emotions, are the so-called um, warm emotions or hot emotions. It's a certain rhythm of life when person does everything on a daily basis with eating, sleeping, communicating. It's called so-called conservative emotion. About the conservative emotion is something like interest of life, when we develop and we constantly are thinking of what is new, what is something that I will learn today. When the person has that emotion, then it's a sign of flourishing of that person. And a very hot or very strong emotion is when we are experiencing joy. Uh, and of course, the ultimate emotion is the emotion of love. And so when we are in that cold scale, a person is unable to do simple things. But when we are in on the scale of these so-called warm emotions, we are able to solve quickly very complicated issues. That's how our brain is working. And this paradigm of us living in this range of emotions is actually giving me an intuition of how we understand grief also from a theological point of view. This understanding of these scales can deepen our theological understanding of grief. Um, in Orthodox and Catholic traditions, uh, I suppose in some of the in some of the Protestant traditions, there is prayer or memorial or thinking about the people who passed away. In Orthodox Church, we have this season before it's part of Lent, where a very intensified prayer for the deceased is taking place. So every Wednesday and Friday we gather as a community of faithful, and we recite the names of those who passed away. Also on Saturdays, it's also kind of a very important part of a liturgical living through grief, because when we are thinking about the people who passed away and we have this connection to them very often, and I'm speaking as a pastor, as a priest, I can witness that these people who are going through this prayer, then they're also entering into that state of being slightly sad and grieving, and sometimes uh, entering the so-called cold scale of emotions. But then when they exit the church and when they reunite as a family, then there's a sudden kind of sparkle of joy. Um, um, this is very, very important. I'm actually, why I'm in this unusual circumstance, because I'm on the pilgrimage to Rome, and right now I'm just 200 meters from St. Peter's Basilica, and I was just able to visit the grave of Peter, and there are so many other saints buried there. The body of Saint Josephat is located there, and it is part. It's a very important part of coming into a cemetery or a church. Ancient churches were built on the graves of saints, and very often, even today, most of the churches have the bodies of people, of those who we commemorate, who we remember, and who we have a connection with. I'm extremely happy to see here Father Manfred. I had a chance of meeting you several times already, and you, Father, work at the memorial at the museum in Poland. It's a very unusual museum. It's a memorial in Auschwitz, isn't it? Right? It's a place where children and world leaders and people from all around the world come to this horrific place in order to go through this understanding of what is grief, what is death, and what are sometimes unusual, to pick a very mild word. I don't want to use very strong language. Um, a machine of war, so to say, that killed millions of people. But this is the place, just like the church or a cemetery with burials, and also a museum like that. It's a place where we are revisiting the whole idea of preciousness of life. I would say that, well, today, world leaders, quite often when they come to Ukraine, one of the first places they go, they visit Bucha or Irpin. These are the places where people were not just killed in a casual way, as it happens during war, but it's a place where people were murdered. There was a whole unhuman expression of hatred that led to the death of people. Just like maybe not on the same scale as in Auschwitz, but today Irpin and Bucha are modern day Auschwitz, so to say. I don't want to take away the importance for the mountain. I understand the scale is perhaps different, but on today, this is what something that I would like to emphasize, that unfortunately these are the places where we have to come. And if I may just interject with this idea, that I really recommend if JD Vance and Donald Trump would be able to come and visit Bucha, and perhaps they could have their reality check and their revisiting of the whole idea of what is right and what is wrong. Because when we come to the places like these, this is where we, in a certain way, we can revisit what is precious, priceless dimension of who we are as humans. So death is, as I said, the coldest emotion. But we don't consider as Christians death as the ultimate end of life. Foundation of our faith is built on the expectation for the resurrection. And we just heard a wonderful presentation by Rodger on the biblical approach to this question. And he gave us many good citations how these passages work in the Old Testament, and also in the New Testament. So um, Bible is giving us a certain paradigm, a certain understanding that grief is a necessary part of our life. With grieving, with commemorating those who passed away, thinking about death, memento mori. You have this medieval monastic expression, which really gives us a better understanding of what life is. On the other side, there's a different venue that I would like to interject into this conversation. Is also connected to the fasting, or this period where we are going through before Easter. Jesus explained that prayer is intensified by fasting. There is a certain connection between these two things. Fasting in itself is not something that gives us grace. That doesn't mean that if we fast a lot, that will make us holy. But when we consciously understand that there are certain things that we would like to uh, minimize, limit in our food, in our daily routine, then gives us more time for these wonderful things that we should be doing in our life, with spiritual reflection, with reading perhaps more Bible or visiting those who are in the hospital. Fasting is a certain way of life which gives us, so trains us in a certain way how we work with our emotions. We have Advent before Christmas, we have Lent before Easter, we have other fasts during the year in the Catholic tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, but there's also a very important part of fasting in the Protestant tradition when people want to intensify their prayer. That's when they enter into that state of not just rejecting food, but it's that understanding of who I am, who am I, what am I doing, what are the certain things that I should say no to. By grieving, by lamenting, um, by recognizing our sinfulness, we are humbling ourselves, and this gives us certain preparedness before the glory of God. To return to the analogy with emotions, our brain cannot produce serotonin all the time. When we are trying to boost its production by drugs or alcohol, the brain gets exhausted. So, in a certain way, we want to teach our brain how to be able to live through joy, but also to recognize the preciousness of sadness and grieving, and sometimes even fear. These are not the things that we should try to escape from, but embrace. And this is actually something that is taking place when we uh, recognize what Jesus did for us. That's what he did. He lived through death, but he also got resurrected. He rose from the dead. He did not take just a beautiful part of our life. He took the totality of our life with our crying and our needs and our fears. Jesus had a soul, a real soul with real emotions, and with everything with human, with, as we humans live through. This is a very important, essential part of his identity, and then our healing process when we get into communication or with communion with him. In the Christian soteriology, we say that descent into Hades, that's where what took place on the cross. Well, there are different biblical passages or different interpretations of the letter of the first letter of Peter, chapter 3, 18 to 19, when Jesus went into the Hades, or into the prison, when he died. The Orthodox tradition says that that's when he went into the heart of Hades, and that's where he took Adam and Eve to bring them up from that bottom of forgetfulness. He brings them back to life. The main icon of the resurrection in Eastern tradition is not Jesus exiting the tomb, but it's actually him entering into the bottom of forgetfulness and to the bottom of death, of that darkness that we say um, that Hades is. So he had to do that in order
I
to,
would ask you
yes,
to come to the conclusions, please, because we run out of
it,
time. So I'm asking you to come.
to finish conclusions. All right, yeah. Um, not just the death, but also suffering, anger, fear, and deep grief lived out by Christ himself on the cross was part of God's demonstration of his love towards humanity. And I'd like to briefly thank Yulia for bringing up this whole notion that Christ, as the Son, had this profound relationship with the Father that was not an ideal relationship. It's not a perfect relationship. It's a real relationship where there's obedience, but also a certain tension between the Father and the Son, what we see on the cross, where hence the grief is necessary part of human empathy and profound experience of human life that puts all humans on the same scale of suffering and justice and profound longing for justice. And it is also paradigmatic for the Christian understanding of our salvation. After the darkness of night comes the light of the day. So after grief, suffering, and revolt comes resurrection, life, and restoration of harmony. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Oleg, for your presentation and for reminding that this is a time of great Lent. And remember, the head of our church, the Godforsakenness, in the beginning of the war said that the big roads, the big pilgrimage of great Lent have started to our country, and it's already the 4th year of this our pilgrimage towards resurrection. And also thank you for reminding us that about this double reality where Ukrainians are living. From our one side, grieving, sadness, and loneliness, but from another side, it's also we combine this another experience of light, inspiration, hope, and we combine. It is combined in our life right now. And thank you for putting it so very clear to us. In order to save time, I just, all those who have questions to Father Oleg, please reserve them to the end of this session. And now I am asking Father Serhiy Dmitriev to his word. Father Serhiy will speak Ukrainian, and Olga will help to translate him into English. Father Serhiy is a chaplain of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, military chaplain of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and he is also a chairman of the board of Eleos Ukraine. He encounters war both as a military chaplain and as the head of the social minister organization within the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Father Serhiy, could you please share your experience of God's presence in the place of sufferings, such as Bucha? And how to see his God's presence and to explain to those people who are suffering and felt alone. Yes.
Мене чутно, я можу починати?
Yes. Yes.
Я таку маю велику честь бути серед професорів, поважних пастирів, просто поважних людей, тому що я не є богословом і не маю таких великих знань, як багато з вас.
Okay, so it's an honor for me to be among such great and honorable theologians and professors. I'm not a professor, I'm not a theologian, so please accept my honor and my
І я перепрошую, що я не знаю англійську мову, і тому я буду дуже короткими реченнями говорити, щоб перекладачу було теж комфортно.
Дякую, отче Сергію. So Father Serhiy is apologizing for not knowing, not speaking Ukrainian, English, only in Ukrainian. Yeah, and just speaking short sentences.
Отже, знаєте, що я хочу сказати? Ну, для мене Буча є важливим взагалі населеним пунктом, тому що я там маю до війни, і зараз ми там маємо шелтер для жінок, які зазнали насильства, домашнього насильства.
Bucha is really an important town, city for me, since there before the war and now currently we are running a shelter for women who suffered violence. Yeah.
І як військовий капелан, звичайно ж, я так сталося, що на другий день разом з військовими я заходив в Бучу, і я бачив ще на другий день уже звільнення, і ще були люди, які мертві лежали на землі, яких ще не встигли прибрати, і це були і собаки, домашні животні, і оце домашні тварини, і люди, вони просто були на вулицях.
So as a military chaplain, on the second day after the free liberation of Bucha, I entered together with military soldiers the city, and we still could see bodies of civilians, of dogs, pets who were lying around the city or on the street.
Але я хочу сказати про інше.
I want to start with another thing.
Знання, які ми набуваємо під час страждань, вони відрізняються від теоретичних знань.
The knowledge that we acquire during our grief, experience of grief, is different from the knowledge in general.
Що я думав раніше про людей, які гинули в Африці, якщо ми згадаємо війну в Ліберії там в 2000-х роках.
What I was thinking about people who separate from the wars in Africa, in Liberia, and
Ліберія, геноцид в Руанді,
genocide in Rwanda,
концтабір Сіднає.
concentration camp in Sydney, I'm sure that African countries.
Сирія, ми можемо говорити про Сирію як різаніна в Хулі, хімічна атака в Гуті, вбивство в Алеппо.
Syrian war, then this chemical attack in some cities, and Aleppo, murders of people in Aleppo.
Чи я, як людина, переживав з цими людьми? Я настільки так, як я переживав наших людей. Як це переживалося?
Do I, being like a human being, as a person, do I like have condolences with these people?
It's the same matter.
Yeah, as the same matter as I have now.
Тому для мене богослів'я після Бучі не існує, тому що богослів'я після будь-якої трагедії, яка була в світі, вони всі однакові. І вони постійно десь відбуваються.
For me, theology after Bucha doesn't exist itself. It's like theology is the same due to all these events that happen around the world. They constantly happening around the world.
Мій досвід, тому що я поховав багато людей, мій досвід, він уже 11-річний. Я на війні 11 років як священник, і як волонтер, і як священник, який допомагає людям, який переживає з ними горе, і я є сам травмований, так само, як і всі наші люди.
So my experience of this war, I'm at war for 11 years now as a military chaplain. I buried a lot of people. As a military chaplain, as a priest, and as a person who is helping other people to live through this war. Yeah, and he also, Father said that he's trauma.
Що відчувають люди під час війни? Що вони відчувають?
How do people feel during the war?
По-перше, це такий крик про справедливість, щоб була правда, правда перемогла.
First of all, that's a cry for justice. We want truth to win.
Чи світ бачить цю несправедливість теж? Це теж питання до світу, до всього світу. Хто це спостерігає?
We want to ask the whole world, does the world see this justice? You can find this justice. The world is like watching us. What do they feel?
І перше бажання, щоб добро було сильним.
And the first desire is for the good, good to be strong.
І ось який мій простий досвід, як священника, як людини просто.
So my simple experience being a priest and a person.
Коли я чую, що Бог допускає страждання, якщо ми говоримо про всі ці події в Сирії, в Африці, в Україні, то це допускає не Бог, це допускає людина. У війни є конкретне ім'я.
When we're talking that God lets this grief, this violence happen, I would like to say that not God, but a man. So each war has man, a person who let this grief happen.
Це не є волею Божою, тільки воля злочинців і людей, які сьогодні скоюють зло, злі вчинки.
That's not the will of God. That's the will of that evil person, this criminal person who just let this evil happen.
І всі, хто спостерігає, всі, хто бачить і нічого не втручається, щоб зупинити це зло, він автоматично, як говоримо, що мовчання продається Бог, так? Що він автоматично стає на сторону злочинця.
Yeah, and all these people who are like witnessing us, who are watching us, they are like became evil people, like criminals, since they are like not participants of this crime, and since they stand, they do nothing, they stand on the side of the evil.
Що робити далі? Що робити людьми, які є в травмі, з такими, як я і інші люди? Що може зробити священник?
So what shall we do further on? What shall, for example, me as a priest do? What shall we do with people who are in grief?
Вчити далі любити життя.
We have to learn them to love life.
Тому що буде запит на помству, але помство, навіть якщо ми побачимо, як кривдник буде покараний, воно не заспокоїть нас.
So there would be like a call for revenge, but revenge wouldn't be enough, even when we would see that like the evil person would be punished, that wouldn't be enough for us.
Священники, ми священники, віруючі люди, можемо бути прикладом для людей, як любити життя.
So priests, spiritual people, like believers, people who go to church, we can be an example for other people to show other people how to love Christ, how to love life.
І джерелом цього життя є наша віра. Я, як християнин, можу сказати, що це моя віра в Ісус Христос. Можливо, що людина з іншої релігійної групи скаже, що це те, що вірить, вона вірить. Але віра є джерелом любові до життя.
So our faith is a source of love for our life. And me as a priest, I can say that my faith helps me to live through it. Maybe people from other denominations can name some other things, but for me personally, that's it.
Лікувати біль любов'ю.
To cure our pain with love.
Але щоб лікувати любов'ю, треба бути наповненим любов'ю.
But to cure other people with love, you have to be like full of love inside.
І не теоретично вболювати, да, а діяти. Це должна бути дія.
Not apply like theoretical knowledge, but do specific actions.
І наша дія – це робити так, щоб слово «війна» було взагалі забуте.
Our first task is to act in such a way that the word war will be forgotten in the future.
Моя одна із улюблених книг – це про хобітів. І ми знаємо, що автор «Властеліна колец» він був віруючою людиною.
One of my favorite books is written by Tolkien, Hobbit, and we know that the author Tolkien was a
Або ми згадаємо серіал «Зоряні війни».
Series Star Wars.
І я думаю, що нове богослів'я должно бути про те, що чи людина, вона є на стороні добра, чи вона є на стороні зла.
I guess that new theology should be like, should take its own position. Does a person should be on the side of evil, on the side of good?
Але я точно ніколи не буду звинувачувати Бога і всіх своїх вірних. Я навчаю, що ми просто можемо бути на стороні Бога, бо Бог є добро і любов, або на стороні зла. Але зло в світі допускає сама людина.
And I won't accuse my parishioners, like people I know, but I know that whether they are on the side of evil or the side of good, but I know that evil is happening around the world due to the will of God, of a man.
І закатовані люди в різних краях світу, в Сирії, в Африці, в Україні, закатовані люди, знищені люди. Це не є воля Божа, а це воля конкретної людини.
And like all these tortures and tortured people, murdered people around the world in Africa, Syria, and in Ukraine, that's not the will of God, that's the will of a separate person.
Ну і ось мій час вийшов, я дуже дякую.
And my time is out, I'm grateful for the attention.
Thank you, Father Sergei, and I'm sure we will come to you with the questions a little bit later after the next speakers, because we are running out of our time. So, but collect, please, the participants of the seminar, please collect all your questions, and our speakers will be very happy to answer them. Thank you, Father Sergei, also for your presentations and about point out that the war has concrete faces, and those who started the war also has concrete, we can name them, for example, and also point out that it's very important not to be neutral in this in not only in this war, but in all the wars happening in the world, and to be on the side of good and on the side of life. Thank you very much. Also, we are coming to our next, last and but also very important speaker, Taras Gatlek. He is launching to our seminar from Moldova. So it's interesting that one guest coming from the USA to Ukraine, and two other speakers are coming to Europe. But I think they have an important mission to do over there. So Taras Gatlek is Vice Rector for Development, International Cooperation at the Eastern European Institute of Theology. He is the head of social work at Scholar Leaders International, consultant for theological educational at Overseas Council United World Mission. Taras will know that lost his brother in the war. Nevertheless, he is an active servant in his community, which is pastoral and social work. He working extensively with the people experiencing suffering and hardship. The question: what wood of comfort do you offer to those who stay in grief? You frequently share your reflections about your grief as well on different social platforms. During your travels abroad, you often encounter people who don't fully understand the reality of life in Ukraine, and some even echo Russian narratives claiming that Ukrainians are simply exhausted and should seek peace at any cost. How do you speak about your pain while also demonstrating that this is a path we must walk, and faith strengthens our fragility, giving us the resilience to carry on? Please, the floor is yours.
Dear friends, greetings. Christ has risen. I am on my way back home to Ukraine, but just was not able to make it in time to join you in Lviv. But I'm glad to see you, every one of you, and thank you for the invitation. I want to share with you my letter to my brother Andriy, which I wrote after he was deadly injured and then died because of those wounds. And I want to demonstrate how Christian faith creates space for both raw protest against evil and stubborn hope in resurrection, and how Ukrainian communities collectively process trauma through ritual and symbol, and how theological reflection must emerge from within suffering rather than hovering above it, and addressing precisely how churches can authentically accompany people through grief while maintaining gospel hope. And my letter represents my personal expression of the theology of grief, blending narrative and contextual theology as our family processed the profound loss of my brother Andriy. On July 21, in 2024, his heart, the heart of Senior Lieutenant of Medical Service, Andriy Dyatlov, stopped beating. A brave warrior, talented military doctor, a loving son, brother, and friend. And he had been severely wounded on July 6, 24, on his 33rd birthday in the Kherson region near Krinky. We said our final farewells to Andriy on July 24 on Independence Square in Rivne before his burial at the Alley of Heroes in the Nove Cemetery. And through this lament, I navigate the theological meaning of suffering within Ukraine's wartime context, also finding sacred space within our family's grief journey while witnessing to both the pain of loss and the Christian hope of resurrection. And my testimony is my contribution to the larger ecclesial task of developing pastoral approaches that honor trauma's depths while pointing toward renewal and justice. So my letter of grief. My dear brother, in this sacred space between heaven and earth, I write to you as both a brother and a theologian, though today the brother's voice cries louder. The psalmist wrote of waters that overwhelm the soul. I now understand this not as metaphor, but as lived reality. My theology has become embodied in tears. When news came of your death, I experienced what the ancient Hebrews called shevirat lahev, the breaking of the heart. We were 6 brothers, now 5 remain, and in this numerical reduction lies a cosmic diminishment. The God who counts the stars and calls them by name surely felt the universe contract when your name moved from present to past tense. In the van on the way to the Alley of Heroes, I sat beside your flag-draped coffin as both Homo dolens and Homo theologicus, the suffering man and the theological man united in one broken frame. The dark lacquer of your coffin reflected back my questions about divine presence in the valley of death's shadow. I trust you are with Christ, yet my finite understanding cannot breach the chasm between here and there. This is the mysterium tremendum of death terrible in its certainty, mysterious in its transition. The white mourning ribbons around your coffin speak a visual theology of both purity and loss. Like the torn garments of biblical mourners, they externalize our internal rupture. These ribbons bind together not just our coffin, but our family's collective wound. Parents who should never outlive their child, sisters who lost their protector, your 5 brothers now diminished to an incomplete circle. In our tradition, we speak of Christ's seamless garment. In death, that garment is torn, yet we trust it will be rewoven in the resurrection. The wooden cross before me, wrapped in an embroidered ritual cloth, stands as the central paradox of our faith, the instrument of execution transformed into the symbol of transcendence. Your name engraved upon it joins the great communion of saints who have passed through death's portal before us. I remember how we discussed Bonhoeffer's cost of discipleship, never imagining the cost would be so literal, so final. Yet, even as I grieve, I hear the echo of Easter. The cross is empty, Christ is risen. This is our Theologica Crucis made personal, not abstract theology, but lived reality. The evergreen cypress wreath in the corner preaches its silence, destroyed by Russian violence and manifestation of the fallen world's capacity for evil. The cypress reminds me that your essence continues. Augustine wrote that evil is privation, absence of good. Your death represents such an absence, a hole torn in the fabric of creation. Yet our faith proclaims that what appears an absence is merely transition. The white symbolizing purity upon the branches reminds me of the Revelation promise. Those washed in the blood of the Lamb stand before the throne in white robes. I imagine you there now, Andriy, clothed in resurrection dignity. At the Alley of Heroes, our private grief enters communion with national lamentation. Like the ancient Israelites who created communal rituals for mourning, we participate in a collective processing of trauma. Your 33 years, mirroring Christ's earthly span, now join the theological narrative of sacrificial love. Your medical calling to heal has been transfigured into a different kind of healing, one purchased at terrible cost. I do not want to release you, Andrei. My being resists this final acknowledgement as Jacob wrestled the angel, demanding blessing before release. Yet I must practice what the mystics called holy indifference, the painful surrender to divine will, not forgetting, but entrusting you to the God who promises resurrection. Your body remains here until the first resurrection, but your spirit dwells already in that place where death shall be no more. Finally, Andrei, until we meet again in the fullness of the kingdom, I remain your brother in both flesh and spirit. Like the disciples after Christ's ascension, I gaze between two worlds, honoring your absence here, while trusting your presence there. This is our family's Holy Saturday, suspended between crucifixion's grief and resurrection promise. We will carry both your memory and your hope as we continue our journey on this silent planet. In Christ's name, your older brother, Taras. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Taras, for you sharing with us, and thank you for sharing with your reflections with the public. I think it's very important for more people in Ukraine and outside to experience what you really experience here, what senses, what emotions we have during this war. And I would call your letter the meeting of death and hope. You know, and it's very paradoxical meeting, but this is meeting in reality that we are living right now. So we are moving to our Q&A session, and we already have two persons raised his hand. So I will give word to Father Ivan Lesko, and afterwards to Helen Rodger. Please, Father Ivan, ask your question.
Thank you. I don't know to whom I can address my questions. I am a priest already almost for 54 years. I read the Theology of Hope of Moltmann. I had a great father, leader, Cardinal Sleepy, Patriarch of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, who taught us that evil will not last long. But during these times of war, I often am asked a question. Christ, when he was dying on the cross, what did he say? My Lord, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? The Lord, God, God-man, Jesus Christ, exclaimed those words. Second, the question is, yes, people can be evil. People cause the wars, not God. But why does the Lord allow these people to come to power? Why did he allow Adolf Hitler to become the dictator of Germany, and because of him more than 60 million people perished in the war, in concentration camps and so forth? Why do people like Stalin, not because of the war, but during his purges, the Holodomor, the Great Famine, why did he permit them to take power? And the same applies to Putin. For 25 years, he is already president of the Russian Federation and spreading war. The paradox of this was that there were many assassination attempts at Hitler in 1938, not to speak about Stauffenberg in 1944. He survived. Why has God allowed Donald Trump to become the president of the United States and causing all this confusion which we have today? He even says that God helped him to escape that assassination attempt when he was slightly hurt in his right ear. I hear these questions, and I am afraid I do not have a satisfactory answer. Can anybody of you present who have presented us their views of this theology of mourning, can anybody of you give me an answer to these questions? Why has God permitted such people to cause so much evil, so much damage to today's world? Thank you.
I think the why questions are very natural and very appropriate. We have to ask the why questions. I mean, Jesus asked that question on the cross. Of course, you know, he was quoting Psalm 22. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why? I think it's very interesting, the juxtaposition of Psalm 22 and right after it, Psalm 23, yea, though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will fear no evil, for I am with you. And I think the answer to the question why is there in Psalm 23, that God is with us even in the time of evil. And I think when we struggle with the issue of why, if we can, we need to reframe the question. Why questions usually are a one-way road to nowhere. We can never satisfactorily answer the question why, but we can answer the question what. What do we do now in the face of this evil? And I think what we do is we don't give up. All the lectures you heard, we're talking about hope and comfort, and all the pastors we mentioned, these chaplains, they're not giving up in the face of evil. Why questions are very challenging to answer, and probably there's no satisfactory answer. The nearest one I got to was Leslie Weatherhead in The Will of God. He was trying to answer the why question. Where is God in the middle of this? And he used the idea of free will. Hitler, Putin, Trump, they have the same free will that you have and I have. We may not like the decisions they make, but if God does not make us puppets, we're not automatons that he controls. There's good and there's evil. So I think our answer to the why question is to say, we may not have a satisfactory answer, but you can answer what? What do Christians do in the middle of this war? And I think Ukraine needs the Christian faith more now than ever before. They need pastors and chaplains, and places like the Ukrainian Theological University and Seminary. They need us now more than ever. One day this war will be over. One day the war will be over. And your children, your grandchildren were asked, what did you do when the Russians invaded Ukraine? And I hope we can say we were faithful. We were faithful to God through Jesus Christ.
Do you think that these questions will satisfy those mothers, those wives, those brothers and sisters who lost members of their family?
Pastor Sergei also would like to add. Yeah.
Знаєте, ми в Біблії можемо шукати дуже багато цитат, дуже багато різних цитат. Але мені подобається більше всього одна.
So we can find a lot of different quotations in the Bible, but there is one my favorite.
Це цитата із пророка Ісаї. Я зараз дословно її не процитую, так на пам'ять, зміст буде той самий.
Yeah, so I don't remember word by word. That's the quotation from the Isaiah prophet book.
І там є таке слово, що «Я почув страждання і плач мого народу, і запитав, це говорить Господь, хто піде замість мене?» І пророк каже, ось я, Господі, я готовий.
So we have such words there. So God said, I heard the lamentation and cry of my people, and I asked, who will follow me? Who shall I send to you to come?
Зазвичай я би хотів, щоб священники всього міра, а особливо в Російській Федерації, вийшли під офіс своїх, як отець там казав, Трампа, там, да, чи кого, Путіна, і з плакатами, навіть просто з плакатами «Зупиніть війну». Але ми бачимо, що сьогодні християнське суспільство, воно не настільки має сміливості навіть зробити це, особливо в тоталітарних державах.
So what I want is like the priests of all around the world take like posters, transparents, and come to the offices of these Trump and so on other presidents. Come with the posters, please stop the war. But as far as I see now, our society is not doesn't have like such.
Тому наша місія бути голосом людей також, говорити про це, кричати про це, говорити. Це головне.
They should be like the voice of the people. They should like shout, cry to everyone about these issues. That's all.
Thank you.
Father left you to add something?
No.
Okay, Helen the Rodger, please write the question from your reflections.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank in particular Taras Diatlik for sharing the testimony of your brotherly grief and love, and sharing the grief of your family, and therein presenting us a very authentic theology of grief. A theology of grief is not, in my understanding, a theology of conquered grief, although there are many texts in the Bible that express hope and resurrection and victory and new life. A theology of grief should be a theology of grief in the midst of grief and lived through grief. There is not a solution. Oh, Father Dechko, we are hearing you. And thank you, Taras, also for bringing up the symbol of Holy Saturday. It is very costly to me, that symbol, and it points towards staying there where the grieving people are. In the case of Naomi, it is not going already to the end of the book, to the end of the story, but remaining with Naomi in the grief through the chapters in the whole story. And only in the end, there is a bit of hope. But the grief, the book is about a grieving Naomi. And it requires a lot of us to stay with the grief and the grieving. Also, Holy Saturday is the other side, I would say the side of the humanity where Christ is descending into hell. It is on the side of humanity, Holy Saturday. remaining with and in the grief. And I would like to ask now Sergei Dmitriev and also Yulia Vintoniv, because I think you were very close to that. How does the symbol of Holy Saturday speak to you in your existential theology?
The silence of the Holy Saturday, it is like really special something for Balthazar. He wrote his book about only the theology of.
Не чути. We can't hear you.
Okay. I'm sorry, I will start again. Do you hear me now? No? You don't hear me?
Це мене шукають?
No. Do you hear me now? Okay. Do you hear me now? No?
Hello.
Yes.
Please speak louder. Прошу говоріть голосніше.
I'm sorry. Okay, I will try again. Holy Saturday is really important for theology of living God Father, because it is a time of silence. It is time of waiting. It is time of absence. It is time of this that I mentioned in Moltmann, God against God. But for me, this silence, it is really special, because I understand that when I try to survive through the grief, I don't need any words. I need silence, and I need hug, maybe, if someone can give me this. And also I need this peace that silence brings. I don't know if this satisfied you, but this is my reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. And how would Father Dmitriev respond to this question?
Switch to your comment. Yes, okay. I guess you left it right. What you think?
А я нічого не казав, нібито я це сказав, чи треба?
If you question, I will translate to Father Sergei. Helen, can you hear?
Yes.
Can you please repeat your question, and I will translate it to Father Sergei to Ukrainian.
Well, I heard also Father Dmitriev, well, in a very existential way, sharing about what he experienced and how he tries to be with the people, be with the military, be with the people who lost their loved ones, be with the suffering, and how to stay and to remain with the grieving. So I would like to ask him also, how does this symbol, or I can also say this reality of Holy Saturday, how does it speak to him? What does it mean to him?
Тобто питання звучить, яке для вас значення має, власне, це поняття Святої Суботи, Великої Суботи Великодньої, але перед тим вступ пані Гелен говорила, що екзистенційно ви, як військовий капелан, дуже наблизилися до цього поняття, як просто побути поруч з людьми в горі, з тими, хто горює, хто втратив своїх рідних. Як ви це можете пов'язати?
Я не зовсім зрозумів питання, можливо, щось не розчув. Я ще коротко.
Перед Великоднем.
Христос сходить до аду, його Він ще не воскрес, але він лежить в гробі в аді, так? І якраз коли переживання всякого горя, це дуже така гарна, поняття пояснити, пов'язати з тим, що люди переживають. Вже в надії Воскресіння, але ще цього Воскресіння немає.
І я би поділив людей, напевно, зі свого досвіду на дві частини.
So for
Це
my
люди на дві частини.
I would divide like all the people in two parts, like I just think in Ukraine, the world.
Для практикуючих віруючих, які виросли в церкві і постійно спілкуються зі священником, їм гораздо простіше сприймати втрату і пояснити для себе, що відбувається. А більша частина людей, яка говорять, що вони є віруючі, але вони, так скажемо, що це не є практикуючі віруючі. І вони очікують від Бога добробуту, спокою. Бог для них більш матеріальна якась субстанція, щоб вона їх захищала і робила, і щоб все було добре.
So for active Christians, it's much easier to accept the loss, to accept the death of our beloved ones. And for those who are not like active Christians, who just believe like in God on words, they perceive God as a material, some material thing, some material substance that should like protect them, should give them wealth, well-being, and like material things. And for them, it's more difficult to accept.
Тому не можна відповісти однозначно. Коли ви питаєте про це, то про яких людей ми говоримо?
For that reason, I just can't give one answer. I have to understand so what kind of people we are talking about.
Для мене, як для священника, я був готовий до війни, тому що я до цього служив 18 років в лікарні і служив помираючим людям.
So me as a priest, I was already ready for this war since for 18 years now. I've been serving as a chaplain in the hospital, and I was serving with people with terminal diseases, people who were dying.
І в англійській мові слово «страждати», да, це буквально з латинської як «нести великий, тягнути тягар». І якщо ти разом з людиною допомагаєш їй тягти або скинути цей тягар, в кращому випадку, і це є служіння священника. Разом з людиною нести і допомогти позбутися цього тягарю.
Yeah, so the English word, I'm not sure whether it's suffer or maybe some other word is from Latin, like to carry one's like luggage together, burden together with the person who is grieving, who is mourning, and that's why the task of the priest to help this person to carry this burden, to carry it together.
А на кінець я хочу сказати, що в українській мові слово «страждати» воно є з двох слів таких. Дати стража, можна так сказати теж. Не знаю, чи українці мене тут підтримують. Дати стража.
Yes, so Father Sergei said that Ukrainian word "страждати" is like to give like a lifeguard, but we are not sure whether that's the best explanation, the best definition for this word.
Але коли Господь дає стража в Біблії?
But when does God give like this lifeguard, guardian in Bible?
Коли людину виганяє з раю, він дає стражу перед раєм. Коли Адама виганяють з раю, да, є страж, стоїть страж, який не пускає людину. І для мене слово «страждання» – це така великий сум по тому раю і повернення до раю. Тому що коли людина живе в хаосі, людство, і скоює злочини, він починає тяготитися до цього спокою, до раю. Але є страж, який не допускає до цього.
So when the first people were expelled were expelled from paradise. So God gave them like this guardian, and they wanted
Would be guardian on the gates of.
Тобто допомогти знайти рівновагу, знайти оцю, скільки любові вони лишиться після цього пережитого горя. І допомогти в людині знайти цю любов. На кінець, щоб вже не відвлікати вас, можливо, я завжди кажу, що би не сталося, виходь переможцем. Хвора людина, яка помирає, щоб ти лишався переможцем, хворобою в голові, лишитися переможцем. Який би кінець не був, а тільки з Богом можна бути переможцем, і в любові можна бути переможцем.
Yeah, so to conclude with, I want to add that all the time I say to people to whom I serve in hospitals, to people who are dying, just overcome your grief, overcome your sufferings, be a winner of your life, like stay a winner and overcome all these sufferings.
Тому що тільки той, хто боровся, може потім перемогти.
So those who were fighting, they can win.
Це про цей досвід, про сходження Христа в ад після розп'яття. Це про боротьбу, але перемога може бути тільки після боротьби і страждань, і воскресіння.
So that's from that experience or from the descent of Christ into the hell, and we can only have resurrection after grief and after suffering.
Okay, I think that we have to make some conclusions in the end of our seminar, and I ask our esteemed speakers for 1 minute to present your final insights. What would be the most precious that you would share with the audience at the end of this meeting? Yeah, please, Rodger, starting from you.
Well, again, I want to thank you for the seminar. I think a final thought I would have is that we talked about theology of grief, and I think grief is not the enemy. We could sometimes think, if I could just get rid of grief, then my life would be perfect. Life would be nirvana, it'd be heaven. We all know the reality is we grieve all the time. I mean, Ukraine is grieving uniquely because of the war. But I'm 78 years old, and I have grieved all my life for different things, you know, the death of parents or grandparents, and the issue of losing a job, relationships, loss of health, limitations, getting older. When I retired, I said, who am I now? So we grieve all the time. So the issue I think we're discussing today is not how to get rid of grief, but how to deal with it. Because if we don't deal with grief, grief will deal with us. And sometimes it's not very pretty. And Naomi in the Bible is a good example. And it took Ruth coming beside her. Ruth in Hebrew means friend. So Ruth was her friend and her helper and her daughter-in-law. And I think in this theology of grief, we need to be present with each other. Sometimes just a ministry of presence. As a minister in the church I was in, I did 500 funerals. So I was standing in the cemetery with people all the time. And sometimes just being there with them as a Christian brother, saying, I care about you. So I think if there is any way to look at grief in the theology of grief, is to realize that God is with us. Sometimes even in silence, God is with us, saying, have hope, have a future, because Jesus Christ is resurrection hope.
Say thank you for Godforsakenness and your experience. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, and also Father Lanking is with us, and Taras Gatlik for conclusion remarks. Taras Gatlik, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Father Roman. My concluding remark is that we are now in the period of life in Ukraine, which we can call the third shot Renaissance, третє розстріляне відродження, when our nation goes through the third Golgotha. And my encouragement, the encouragement I find in the 7 exclamations of Jesus on the cross. And I think this is, for me, the most biblical existential expression of grief when God is on the cross and speaks to people and speaks to God and speaks to the criminals and also to the Roman soldiers. And I find the encouragement, especially when Jesus was crucified on the cross, he was also suffering, but he continued to care about the community. He told Mary, this is your son. He told John, this is your mother. So, and I think this is where Ukrainian church and Ukrainian nation, so when we are suffering, when we are grieving, that we should still learn to care about the community, to build new connections, new relationships, new empathy. And this is my prayer about. Thank you.
I know that Father Oleg and Father Sergei left the seminary because they have other commitment, but that my concluding remarks would be, I think that sometimes grief and joy are both the parts of our life. So because sometimes we just speaking about grief, about mourning, and we get stuck in these emotions, and afterwards people who are mourning for a long period of time, sometimes they get depressed. So I think that the Christian approach is to give through hope, give also people a sense of compassion, to see things around them, and to even to experience love and joy as well. So I think that you can't declare that if in grief I can't rejoice, I can't smile, and so on. So I think that the human being is so much complicated, and this is the Christianity proposes us to be both. Sometimes we mourn, as Paul said, mourn with those for mourning, be sad, and be rejoice with those who are rejoicing. And thank you, all of you, all the participants who stayed alive and through the internet connection for your time spending with us on this important theme. And I think it's also crucial. We started, where is this God among the sufferings? And Father Ivan Desko already repeated this question. And then I think that we don't have clear answers on this question, but we have some proposals, some directions, and sure we should go together through this path, through this great land, to the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus. Let God bless you all. Let God bless all those who suffer in Ukraine and around. Let God stop this full Russian aggression and be witness of your grief, which could also be transformed into through the hope, to the new life in our Lord. Thank you all, and see you when we will have our online meetings. And I would like also to thanks to Kerk and Actie for supporting our event. Have a peaceful evening or day. Bye bye. That's a great job for you.
Yeah, I'm not temperature.
You're going to that's challenging. Did you do well? Did you do? Because I didn't know what he was saying.